worse. I did some work on a device. When we tore it all apart, we found out that its guts was nothing but a beagle bone. Okay, so, and then white label products. This is really bad. Vendors are white labeling everything out there. So you buy a product, you think it's from company A, and it turns out that same product's used by dozens, if not hundreds of different companies with different labels on it. Somebody over here has attacked a product and found all kinds of vulnerabilities on it. That doesn't mean this product that's white labeled doesn't have those. It's high probability it does, and that needs to be considered when looking at these. User manuals. I love user manuals. Some of the coolest hacking I've done was by spending time looking at the user manuals. I remember working in a company, someone said, Daryl, we dare you to try to break into our critical systems that are used for billing. I'm like, okay. I downloaded the manuals. I was into a system in 30 minutes, and it's the same way here. Understanding the manuals may obviously point out design flaws and vulnerabilities, backdoor information, all kinds of stuff. Spend time in those manuals. And we have an example there. Component data sheets. Going out, when you open up the device eventually, you want to look at the data sheets. Track out all the chips that you can identify, what they do, what their purpose is. You're going to encounter new devices being used. You want to understand those. And then FCC data. How many people are familiar with going out to FCC? Okay, that's kind of key. We want to be able to do that, and we've got a slide for that also. So moving from there in the device recon, obviously, FCC. So you can go to the back of a device and you can find an FCC ID on the back of the device. You go out to FCC, you can enter this in there, and you will get the data on the device. This device had to go through testing. They had to submit it to the FCC. This will often contain breakdowns of the device taken apart. So before I ever pull any screws, nuts, bolts, or take a hacksaw to any device, I literally will go to the FCC, pull down the diagrams, and take a look at it. How is it constructed? If I'm taking a Dremel tool to the device, the last thing I want to do is when I'm done cutting it open, find out I sliced one of the chips in half. This is how you prevent that. You get a breakdown of the device on the inside for the most part. FCC test reports. These will lay out the frequencies and a lot of critical information if you're looking at attacking the RF area of a device. Okay, this was cool. So there's a whole backstory on this. This happens to be a panic button. So early this year, late last year, I was contacted by the Associated Press, and they goes, you know what? These panic buttons are actually being recommended by the Colombian government to protect dissidents from being kidnapped. And we're really curious, since our AP people are actually using these devices, what is the security risk? So we brought the device in. I did everything to it. I looked at the entire ecosystem. But one thing I looked at, and there was a number of vulnerabilities between this and the cloud API functionality, but the one I want to point out is the service manual. So I open up, the way this device works is, you press the button, you can set up 3 phone numbers in it. You press the button, it'll dial these phone numbers in sequence, and it'll also send text messages out if you want to. This is actually configured over SMS. Okay, and you can set a password on it, or pass string. It's like 6 characters. So you can lock this. So once it's locked, anyone sending a SMS message will not get anything back. Okay. Without that, you can actually send a text message with a command and it'll respond back with data. It is a brick for the most part. They press the button, it's not going to call anyone. To make matters worse, this thing's so functionally advanced, they can then send messages and get your GPS coordinates. They can also send a message to reconfigure this thing to turn the lights, alarms off, and turn it into a listening device remotely. So, and on top of that, when we got into the hardware, just to cover it, I was looking for a way, if I did not know what the phone number was, but I know the phone number ranges, how would I identify a device out there if the actual password was set on it? Because there's no response back. Pulled the firmware, dumped the firmware, and we found an undocumented command in there. It was very similar. It was reboot, but it was all uppercase with the exclamation point after it. It didn't actually work, but what it would do is respond back with an error message, identifying that it was one of these devices. So then you could basically SMS dial them, war dial them, identify all the devices that have that. At that point, you could literally just shut them all off, start GPS tracking in and listening to the people, which I don't know about me, but if I was in a country trying to protect myself, that's the last thing I would want to use. But for all due respect to the produced these, their statement was this was not meant to protect people from being kidnapped by Colombian drug lords. It was meant for something you give to your grandmother in case she wanders off, in case she falls down or something like that, which from a risk factor, the risk greatly is reduced at that point. But using one of these devices to protect yourself from being kidnapped by anybody would be the So, oh yeah, before we get to the next slide. So how many people here have a Wink 2 in their home? Only one?
Sorry, it's actually in my suitcase right now.
Okay, well that doesn't really count. I can't believe people here don't have a Winks. How many people here actually have IoT in their house? Okay, well I'm a little more comfortable now. I'm starting to worry about it there. It's like technology with no technology. Hughes. I haven't looked at those. So looking at the mobile application for the Wink 2, and this is what we put out, and this is not an uncommon problem. Even though Android and iOS have built-in functionality to actually encrypt data in storage, especially this type of key data, passwords, all that stuff, in this case they did not. And here we have the OAuth token. This OAuth token is always valid as long as you're logged into the device. How many people log out of their devices on all their IoT apps? Nobody. It defeats the whole purpose of having IoT if you got to log in every time to turn your lights on in your house. So as you see, we have this actually stored in clear text on the device. So if someone gets that, they can control your environment. This is going to get much worse here in a minute. But we're going to move over here to Insteon Smart Hubs. Anyone have an Insteon in their house? I heard a laugh back there. Okay, yeah. Same thing. We have passwords, clear text. There's my password if everyone wants it. Get out there and log in. Of course, that particular device is like in multiple pieces now, so I don't know if it'll do you much good. And I think I changed the password also. And we also, hardware has passwords. Cool thing with the hardware here, it has a fixed password and a fixed username, and they're always different on every product. So that's kind of cool. It was the first company I've seen doing that, and I liked it. But they're actually storing it on your phone in clear text, which could or could not be a problem based on how good you are at keeping your phone or losing it, and whether you use iOS or some kind of encryption and all that type of stuff. So moving from there, we get into the cloud and web APIs. Again, encryption, storage, transfer, these things to be considered. Authentication, session management. Remember, session management, we just talked about the OAuth. We're going to dig into this a little deeper. Common web vulnerabilities, cross-site scripting, cross-site, the list goes on and on and on. We know about web vulnerabilities. And when you're doing evaluation or testing, when you can legally have access to do those, test for all of those. You're going to find them. Probably 7 out of 10 times when I'm testing an IoT technology, I find problems in the APIs, almost always. Some of them quite critical. This particular device, I don't have pictures of it, but it has what's known as real-time tracking. So this phone takes a card and it communicates over port 7050 to your cloud API, and it'll track your data so you can go online and look at that. If you have an account on that system, you can look at everyone's data on the face of the earth, okay? You can actually configure their devices through the APIs to the device also. And the list goes on and on of failures. The communication from this device to the cloud APIs is not encrypted. No authentication to pass the data. All it does is pass the ESN9 number. I get that all shit mixed up, but the identifier for your phone. And so I actually, as a test, was able to send data to a device that I had control of and actually make the device jump from Dayton, Ohio to Russia and poison the data. So there's always API issues out there. Also, last time I checked, none of their APIs have been fixed. So moving back to the Wink 2, it turns out there's a couple things to point out. So when you log off from the application, the mobile application, you think you're logging off. It's going to send a log off out to the cloud API saying, I've logged off. No, the only thing it does is it passes this X device identifier out there and basically says delete it. That is not used for absolutely anything that I could identify. It does not log you out. So when you log out, you do not log out. On top of that, it turns out the OAuth token, when you log out, is not flushed. So it's not revoked. The OAuth token appears to stay valid for 30 days. So if you lose your phone, what's the first thing you're going to do? You're going to go in and you're going to change the password on your account. And you would expect that to revoke all tokens associated with your account. The answer to that is no. In this case, it does not revoke none of the tokens. Any token assigned appears to stay valid for at least 30 days, or as long as it's continually used. So as far as I know, the vendor's fixing these issues, and they should have. The other one's been fixed that I know of, dealing with the Wing 2, and I'm pretty sure this one's been fixed also. But I mean, think of the ramifications of that. I mean, people lose their phones all the time. Most of the time when you lose your phone, the people just want to steal your phone. Unless somebody in this room finds it. Then the whole model changes. At that point, you may go, hey, what can I get off this? And hopefully you're ethical enough not to do that. But you have the knowledge and the capability to do that. Once you have that OAuth token, which is setting on the phone, and you continue to use it, this poor soul can never not have you have full control of everything in their house. The Wing 2 device is not a standalone product with its own sub-products. It is basically an integration platform. So it has all the protocols, Zigbee, Z-Wave, all of them, and it integrates with not every product, but most of the products out there. So literally I have the Wing 2, and I have like Insteon light bulbs connected to it. Disassociate all your devices, reset them all, and rebuild your entire house environment. That's the only way to be sure that you're not going to wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning and your lights are going to be going on and off, and your TV coming on and off, and who knows, your Amazon Echo talking to you, who knows. Sky's the limit. Any questions? Okay, so then we get into the network environment. Again, you know, we're talking about exposed services on the network. You want to look at those. Authentication, access rights, encryption, intra-product ecosystem communication. So you have all these sensors and devices. You want to be able to track and trap all that type of data and look at it and evaluate it for security issues. So this particular one, which I thought was the absolute perfect example. Anytime you're looking at a home automation IoT technology and you test it, there's one thing you always need to test for. What is fail state on the device? When I mean fail state, what happens if the internet goes down? Can you no longer open your garage door? Can you no longer turn your lights on and off? Because if that's the case, you probably bought the wrong product. Most of the time, those products will go to local mode. Local mode means the devices are going to start communicating local to the particular device. On these particular technologies, when I killed it, my cell phone and everything switched over and started communicating over port 4000 to the device, unencrypted, unauthenticated. And so what I did here, this is just an example of a snippet from a block of data from the Perl script that I wrote, where I decoded all the data and I wrote a quick Perl script so I could take this home automation system, and when it went into local, or whether it was in local mode or not, that port was always up and running. Just didn't know what it was used for until it went into local mode and I was able to capture all that communications. So at that point I captured all the communications, ran the product through all of its functionalities, trapped everything, decoded all the packages, and found out that I could turn around and write a program where I can send a packet to the device and tell it to jump from a person's Wi-Fi to a Wi-Fi I control. And that's what this packet actually does. It switches the SSID and the pre-shared keys to move it over to another device. So literally, if somebody had access to your network where this was running, they could literally move the controls of the device to something that you can man in the middle or control yourself. Also, key to remember, you know, these devices and how they communicate or capture firmware or receive firmware varies in different ways. Sometimes firmware will come down to your cell phone and be deployed out that way. Sometimes the device will call out to the internet. This particular device would call out to the internet to China to get its firmware upgrades. But you had to tell it to from the mobile application, but the mobile application never received the data. So you're able to capture it with Wireshark. It was unencrypted in transfer. The only saving grace was the firmware was actually encrypted. So they did one thing good, but if you've never used Wireshark to strip out packets under file export object HTTP, when you capture all that communications, it'll actually just dump the binary out for you, and you just get the binary that way. So if you're thinking, oh, how do I get the firmware? I can't get in between the device properly, or, this is the way to do it. If you can and it's unencrypted, you can actually get the firmware this way. And sometimes it's way much easier than cutting the device open and pulling chips and crazy things like that. But cutting things open and pulling chips is way much funner, in my opinion. But it's not always the practical approach. Especially if it's a paid engagement that's time consuming. Now often when I'm doing research in my lab and I can get the firmware this way, if I open up the device and I see something I hadn't seen recently, I'll take the firmware off the device just to refresh my mind and process on how to do it. Or if I've never done it before on a new chip. So I get a new chip, it has onboard flash on the actual CPU, and I can get the firmware this way. If it's not a paid engagement and it's research, I'll pull the firmware off the device directly just to get that knowledge, to build that knowledge level. Because sooner or later I'm going to be in a case with that same chip environment where I can't get it this way. Physical embedded hardware inspection. In my opinion, when you get ready to get to this phase here, take your time. Open the device up and just spend some time looking at it. Record all the chips, write them all down. Go to the data sheets, review the data sheets. Look at how the thing works. Sometimes you can trace out some of the runs on the device and see what chips are talking to what chips, and kind of gather that data because it comes in really critical. And we'll have an example here later where I was able to do this and add some value by understanding the inter-component communication where I could. Obviously, some of these devices are multi-layered. It's not easy to identify, but where you can identify all the piece parts in a communication. And I'll often spend a number of hours just looking at the device, looking at it under a microscope, looking at the leads, looking at the runs. How's it all put together? How's it all work? You want to look at the chip, CPU, memory, communication, physical ports, Ethernet, USB serial, UART, JTAG, SPI. The cool thing is there's still a lot of vendors out there that are nice enough to tag everything on the board for you. I always like that, It's like, yeah, thank you. That's the UART. That you just saved me some time. There's a header there for me and everything. You're nice. That is pull the data off of it so we can actually look at the firmware. And if it goes right, it's an example we have here is on another device. But once you see it, you'd be like, damn, that's easy. So, just in this area, I want to just show about some of the examples of pulling actual data off chips and pulling chips. This happened to be a Wink 2. And this was an interesting situation. So I had the Wink 2, and there used to be a TSOP 48-pin NAND chip right there. There's no longer there. So I pulled the TSOP. I pulled the firmware off the device for further evaluation, which has been its own little headache off to the side. And then you're stuck with this board. Now this board no longer works. If other people that do this type of work are like me, I don't like breaking nothing. So my ultimate goal is let's put it back in service. So then I start thinking, if I solder that chip back on there, which is fairly easy, this right here, the chip's only about the size of a penny, okay? From here to here is about the width of a penny. So the chips are pretty small. It's a 0.5 millimeter pitch on these chips, but it's really easy to solder. It's amazingly easy. Go out to Google. There's some demonstrations of what's called drag soldering. Once you see that done, because I was like, okay, how do I put this on? Go out to Google. This was a while back. Go, okay. I'm like, holy mackerel. And the first time I did it on another board, it worked. First time, and I'm like, this is so easy. So look up drag soldering. Makes it so simpler. But in this case here, I was like, well, what happens when they come out with a firmware 2 weeks from now? Am I have to pull the chip off again? So I went out on the internet, start searching, and I found on eBay a chip socket for a TSOP 48. And I turned around and I soldered that on the board. So now I just open the lid, pull the chip out, and I got the latest, greatest firmware off the device. And it works. The whole thing works. You power it up and it runs. Putting this socket on was like amazing pain in the ass. Okay. Okay. Because most of the surface mount device chips have what's gull wings. So the leads kind of stick out the side so you can drag solder. This one had pins that stuck straight down. And they were up underneath the lower edge. So we had it tilted at an angle under a microscope, and I was able to drag solder and get it to work. But there was a couple solder bridges that I had to clean up. So it took me 2 or 3 tries and about 15 minutes to actually get this actually on there. And of course, then you're like, you put the chip in, you cross your fingers, and you plug it in, you're waiting, is the smoke gonna get out or not? You know, you plug it in, and the Wink 2 came in, and I'm like, damn, I'm good. Of course, that's what you always tell yourself until the smoke gets out. So, which does happen. Trust me, I've smoked a few items in my days. So moving from there, another interesting way for gathering data, and this one I want to demo over there too so you can actually see it. So I'm looking at this device. This is the Insteon device. And I wanted to figure out how the whole thing was configured. This particular chip, MRF49XA, is actually 3 different frequencies. It's 915, 884, and 433, I believe. And turned out that I wanted to understand how this chip was actually being configured in the circuitry. So it has a small PIC processor down here. It's real simple single functionality PIC processor, or minimal functionality PIC processor. So it turned out, mapping out the board and all the pieces and the data sheets, this connects to that over SPI, and when you power it up, it sends all the configuration data to the chip. Configuring the data configures the frequency, it configures the offset, because this is a frequency shift keying device, so it gives you the offset from center frequency to 1 and what the 0 is for the shift frequency, gives you that kilohertz range. It gives you the whole list of different things. And it's kind of cool. So you just hook up a data analyzer to these key things here, and you turn the power on and you capture it. And then you take that data, and the output is this data right here. And you go to the actual data sheets, and it lists this stuff, every one of these, exactly like that. And you can map out every part of that chip. So anytime you're getting ready to do some RF analysis of a device, consider looking at the chip and seeing if you can tap into any of the communications on the chip and how it's configured. Because that data you extract out of there plays a big role when you get around to actually doing the RF testing if you want to try to decode. Now on this particular device with the Insteon, it turned out that Insteon puts out a standard document or a white paper on their entire protocol. Everything in that is wrong. Okay, the chip was not configured based on most of the stuff they said. So they said it was like a 60 kHz offset. It was 75 kHz offset. They said the center frequency was 915, and it's actually, in my case, is 915.6. And it varies between devices. I guess you have some kind of changes or drift there. But turns out I wasn't the only one. Recon. So remember the whole recon thing. So I come back to this phase here, and I go to decode all this stuff, and the data that I got off of it helped me get a little further in the decode, and I'm like, this shit doesn't make sense. What else is wrong? Well, I did a little recon, and we'll get back here in a second. Hold up. Wait a second. Oh, that's another. So we'll get back to this. But it's another story, so we'll get back to that in a minute. So moving from there, also, this was kind of an interesting one. Sorry, my story kind of jumps around a little bit. But firmware extraction. So I hadn't seen this. So every one of your cell phones has what's known as an embedded multimedia controller chip in it. Massive amount of storage, pretty amazing. And I hadn't seen these in IoT tech devices until recently. And I've come across a couple of them that opened up. I'm not going to say what this device is, because it doesn't really matter who the vendor is. It's about the multimedia controller chip. So I'm looking at this chip, and I'm doing a lot of research, and there's a lot of data out there in reference to research on forensics on phones around this area. So as you can see, it's a BGA chip. There are no leads on this thing. So got to get the chip off there, right? So yeah, so out comes the hot air system. So hot air system was great for pulling this. The tape on here is actually heat protection tape. So I mapped out everything around it because I obviously don't want my hot air gun blowing caps and resistors off the board. So I tape everything down with the heat thing, and it just takes me a few minutes, and I can lift the chip off there. So I want to show that. So let's click over here. So they make these devices here. And as you can see, it's an actual SD card. And literally, you pull the chip out, you drop it in here, and you'll see. If it works. It's my only one demo. See if it comes up. Just thinking about it. Okay, there we go. Let's see if this works. So you literally put the chip in here after you've cleaned it up. You come down to your SD slot. You plug this in. And you mount up the entire. I thought, this is cool. So I bought these, and there's like 4 of them. They're different sizes. That one's the smaller chip, is 115 BGA. This one's like a 221, and they go up. So the eMMCs, which is a multimedia controller, embedded multimedia controller. There's eMCPs, which is embedded multi-chip packages, and those contain both the RAM and the flash. So it was kind of like cool when I started doing this. It makes it so much easier. You know, there's nothing better than just having it mount up for you without even thinking about it. And it was like $95. So I was talking to one of my friends earlier yesterday, and we started talking about the eMMCs. And I said, yeah, and I went out and bought this thing for $95. I dropped the chip in, I plug it in, it all mounts up. And he's like, what? What? I spent days building one of those. I'm like, $95, man, Shanghai Suppress. Shipped it right to my house. It took 2 weeks. So let's go ahead and switch back over. Any questions?
Yeah. For those of us that are interested in starting to dabble with some of these hardware aspects of what you're doing, do you have a device that you recommend that's like kind of a nice entry level, easy to grab firmware, easy to connect to like the UARTs and stuff like that?
Yeah, if you want to connect to like UARTs, I just like the from Exhibitor. It has, I think it has JTAG, SPI. You can actually use it to pull firmware off SPI flash chips. You can hook up UART with it. It's what, 40 bucks? 45 bucks, dirt cheap. I would go with that. I would recommend, like I have like a JTagulator we can plug in and automatically kind of map out the UARTs and the JTags. That's like 160 bucks. But I think if you're just trying to map out UARTs, sometimes like to do multimeters. I hate that. And Ben Walk will work on it every time. Perfect training platforms. Anything that's more than 3, 4, 5 years old. I actually did a bunch of training not too long ago showing people stuff, and I went out and bought, oh gosh, what was it? The Cisco WET 2000. Try it again. Command control, replay attacks. Replay attacks are so easy to do, and it quickly validate. Do the right tuning, there's plenty of documentation out there. Do replay, it's vulnerable. This was reported before me, and I mentioned that all their standards document didn't actually map how the chip was actually configured. Well, there's some really cool work that had already been done, and I recommend looking at this work. Peter Shipley, DEF CON 23. I'm not going to go back and go through everything he did. Watch this presentation. It goes through a number of the things I was dealing with on the Insteon and some of the issues with that and the issues with their documentation versus actually how the device is configured and how the protocol works. It's actually amazing. It's a really cool presentation, and he actually has tools for attacking the Insteon protocol and decoding it. Decoding tools that he's written out there. So I do recommend checking that. I got the firmware from the vendor. I still go into the device and attack the device to get the firmware. Knowledge, building that knowledge on the various chips, how to get the data, how inter-chip communication works, how the RFs are configured, how the processes are configured, the different versions of flash chips, whether it's a TSOP 48 or standard 8-pin flash chip or all the way to an eMMC device. It's ultimately about building that knowledge level, because then it plays into the next job that you do for evaluating the overall security of that ecosystem. So any questions before we conclude? Yes, sir.
Is it okay to call somebody in for warranty support if you break it?
I've never actually done that. Sure, why not? You can always call them in.
Just play stupid.
Yeah. It doesn't work anymore. Yeah, that's kind of interesting. So yeah, I like violate warranties all the time, but I don't expect them to fix the stuff. Okay. It was like, I don't know what happened. My Dremel tool just like cut it in half when I wasn't looking. I looked at it and compared to other chips on the board, and I'm like, damn, it's pretty close. You would have to really get it under a microscope to really tell that it wasn't factory. Unless you leave all the flux on there. And the worst thing is a friend of mine had some paste flux. I don't know where he bought it. It was like at Goodwill or something. But once he put that on there and it got heated up, and it was like he needed a chisel to get it off. Yes, sir.
How do you deal with epoxy blobs?
Oh gosh. Okay, so epoxy blob. So we were looking at the Cujo. I don't know if you're familiar with the Cujo. It's like a firewall. So I cut the Cujo open, and it had all these test pins that had epoxy blobs across it. And I went online, and this one guy was like using a grinder, and another one was using a milling machine. I took a hot air reflow, heated it up till it's slightly discolored, let it cool, and flicked it right off. So it's a matter of just trying a lot of different methods. The worst one I ran into dealing with epoxy, we were doing an engagement, and I said we had a chip, we wanted to get it out of circuit just to make sure that was out of the picture, get the processor mounted up separately, power it up, feed it everything, see if we can get data off of it because we were having problems in circuit. And I unsoldered all the leads, and it wouldn't come. It was literally epoxy to the board. So there's a picture of me with a chisel knocking this chip off the board. We got it off the board, and there was a big blob of epoxy where they glued it to the board. Yes, sir.
You alluded a couple of times to companies not patching security flaws that you found. In light of things like the dying attacks and homes getting internet and the internet and stuff like that, how do you feel the companies are responding back to securing their devices with appropriate levels of security?
I think 95+% of the companies I've dealt with are very proactive. We contact them, we give them the information. We typically don't disclose until 60 days. If a company can't get it done in time and they reach out to us, obviously our job's about security, not insecurity, but most of them are really quick at fixing things. One of the companies that I complained about their Zigbee home automation protocol, which everyone knows is totally flawed. They set up a conference call, and I sat down with a number of their engineers, and we just walked through every one of the vulnerabilities. And they're like, you do know we can't fix that because it's this, it's an open standard that hasn't been fixed. It needs to be fixed by the standard organization. We're like, yeah, you're right. Let's go back and fix the blog post. And we added that to the blog post to correct it for their sake. But yeah, all these companies are very involved, very proactive, and very recipient to most of the issues, with only a few small cases where they don't. A lot of times they say, hey, we'll fix it, and then they fix it without telling us, and then some of the communication doesn't get done, and then we publish it. And usually within a few hours of us publishing, they come back and go, oh yeah, we fixed that, we forgot to tell you, and then we update the blog. But it's pretty rare for things not to get fixed, in my opinion. At least the things that are important. Obviously, we report some things to them that, it's subjective. And I'm fine with that. They're not like horrible critical errors, but it may be, some other issues around it that we're not aware of. And we have those discussions with those vendors, and we, express to them why we think this may or may not be a risk. And then they move from there. But yeah, they're usually pretty good. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it.
Folks, we are disappearing the room. If you are in here now, please exit. If you want to see the next talk, get in line.
at least on the Android. I haven't done it on the iOS.
Well, I mean, in the next minute.
So that's the case. The only encounter I had was actually on the Android. Do you have a business? No, I don't. But oh gosh, here I'm yeah, if you take my name on the schedule, tweet it, or text it, or look at it on the internet, I'm the only one of them on the face of the earth where my name's so screwed up in the way it's spelled.
Is it really? Your name is screwed up?
First and last name. My first name is spelled D-E-R-E-L, last name H-E-I-L-A-D.
That's true.
And there's only like 200 Highland fans in the entire United States, so for weird spelling of Daryl on it, I'm the only one on the face of the earth.
I appreciate it. Daryl's going to pack up and he's going to be outside for any more Q&A. In other words, if you want to talk to him, head on outside.
I just want to ask you what kind of a magician you are. 15 minutes and 3 tries is a pain in the ass.
What do you need to do?
I was banging my head on the car for 3 more days. You know what? I mean, come on, man. I will.
This one? Which one? That here? This one?
Go ready, G.
Facebook?
Get out of here, out of the way.
Clear in the room. You got to go. All right, you can say.
Appreciate it.
I'll give him a
Anything else? I got some stuff here. Chat with you about Wink.
You want to see my,
You got it?
Do we have power?
That's a voice. So the OS token on Wink, did you find it on here? Not on the board, right?
yeah, it's not on the mobile application.
On the Android.
Yeah, it's on the Android. I did not look at the iOS. My iOS jailbroke was
Front to the back. Keep coming. Yeah, no, I don't use iOS. I use Android. Keep coming. I have iOS.
yeah, the Wink's a good product. I use it in the whole house.
Yeah, I have it. So I have a bunch of devices.
Yeah, so they fixed all this stuff.
You did that?
You want me to put it up here?
I know they fixed the,
You said you didn't know if they fixed the token exploration.
they were
Stand over here with you.
They were supposed to start working
Yeah,
on token
really
exploration.
good idea. Since anything further to
Hopefully to the right
will block the screen. Do you need more slack?
Not today.
I remember the AP of my GBI. Or GBI's GBI or something like that.
What are you looking for?
Oh, he is right.
Who, me?
Hey, Josh. Hey,
Just so you know,
Is that something we can use?
yes, it stays here. He was looking for it.
and I don't think this is necessarily you, but because I'm sitting here, I was in your very first meeting, and so here I can't see the screen because it's not screen without nothing. So I see it. Okay, well, I'll wait till I'll make sure.
Yeah, as long as you don't
Yeah, I know that.
I don't know why they said that.
No, they wanted to put the rules in place.
But yeah, I mean.
Hey, look at that. Sweet.
Oh, I like the title.
So, question for you, sir. Yes. If you stand right behind you, you'll see that you see absolutely nothing. Because, you know, and I don't know for sure if there's anything that can be done relative to the way the laptop is stamped, so you can see what you're defending for, or what. Because I actually was first, so I want to sit on the end of this.
Are you willing to move your chair?
I absolutely wouldn't move my chair. How far my head can move to be able to see behind me. We'll figure it out. As long as you realize it's not getting really weird and stuff.
Thank you, everybody. You're my favorite attendees.
You say that to all the guys and gals.
I got it.
HDMI handsome adapter.
Yeah, I'm good. So I think we got like 7 minutes.
Is that any better?
Yeah, it's actually a fair amount better, thank you. Between the two, it's pretty good.
Guess I should mute that.
Yeah, probably a good call. It's VGA.
Don't need it.
It's working there, it's not working over here though. So it's not the cable, it's not the connector. I think I heard, well, plug it back in. Or does it have to be ejected?
Yeah, you can unplug it.
Not coming up on my...
Start or what?
Oh, we got 5 minutes.
Yeah. We good to just start? I think it's 5 minutes till top of the hour. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to attend DerbyCon as well as attend our talk. My name's Edmund Brummagem. I'm a security researcher with Cisco Talos. Prior to starting with Talos and starting my role as a threat researcher, I spent a good part of the last decade doing digital forensics and incident response in a variety of different critical infrastructure sectors and security operations teams. So a little bit about me, I love analyzing malware and just attacks in general. I always love coming across a unique attack or a unique threat, ripping it apart, and then figuring out how it works, how it could potentially impact organizations, and then make sure that customers are protected as well as the research that gets published for the entire world so that the internet in general is safer. I'm also addicted to punk rock, so I'm a huge music fan. Punk rock specifically is one of my favorite types of music. I've also been told that I am a cynical bastard, so to take with that what you will, but that may be reflected in portions of this presentation.
Hi, I'm Colin Grady, also a threat researcher with Cisco. I have a pretty broad background in security. Started with the SOC, worked my way up through engineering, architecture, digital forensics as well, before finally landing in the research. Probably my favorite thing about this job is the hunt. Love the hunt, savor the kill, being able to stop the bad guys. It's what we do. And probably most prevalent thing about my personality, I'm a serial introvert. So. And now what you guys are waiting for.
So why did we put this talk together? Well, there were a few reasons. One of the main reasons is that you know, we've seen this term, this term fileless malware thrown around in the media, around in the industry for the past couple of years, and we wanted to put together some quantitative information about, like, what are these threats? What do they actually look like? What are the characteristics we're seeing in the wild? Because organizations and researchers need to be aware of how these threats work, so that they can protect their organizations, so that they know what they're looking for, so that they can understand, you know, what is this term that's been thrown around, right? Terms are nothing new in this industry. There's a lot of different terms. They get thrown around for no other reason than for marketing purposes or to, you know, get clicks or things of that nature. And we wanted to just put together this talk to really break out and walk through some of the actual threats that we've seen in the wild recently. Not gonna, we're trying to put this information out here not to like start an argument about like what a term means, but more of provide information and context around, you know, a term that's been used very extensively over the past couple of years. We're pissing us off because frankly we hate FUD, and there's been a lot of it around this term over the past couple of years, right? So the headlines, right? Let's walk through a couple. So we've got a new term apparently, advanced volatile threat, new name for old malware technique. AVTs are not widespread yet because APTs are working just fine, but they could one day start a cyber war. What does that actually mean, right?
It means someone's selling something.
So in this, is it true? Are these things really, really that hard to detect? And then my personal favorite here, fileless malware, an undetectable threat. So as someone who's spent his entire career in a blue team role, you know, that triggers me a little bit. So some of the research that we've been doing recently is directly related to, you know, how do these threats actually work? We see a lot of different malware families that are being classified as fileless, but are they actually fileless? And that's really what this talk is about. So what this talk is not. So we're not going to cover hardware or firmware-based threats, implants, things like that. Those aren't really what we're concerned with. We're also not going to be covering things that right outside of what's considered the normal OS file system, so like master boot record-based rootkits and ransomware, things of that nature. We're specifically talking about some of the common threats that are being classified as fileless and that have been over the past few years to try to shed some light on how they work, how they function, and whether or not they're actually fileless, do they leave artifacts on systems when they're infected, etc. So, right, what is fileless malware? So here's a completely not comprehensive list of some examples of different threats that have been classified as fileless malware over the years. A lot of people don't understand how like old of a technique this actually is, but there's some examples from the early 2000s. But you can really see that it started to take off over the past few years. As a result, we've seen this term thrown around a lot more. You can see from 2014 on, year over year, we're continuing to see new threats that people are classifying as fileless in the wild, and we expect that to continue to increase. So I want to talk about the two different types of fileless malware that we're really going to talk about. So it's kind of broken down into buckets, right? We all like buckets as a way to classify things based on characteristics about them, functionality, you know, things of that nature. So we've got in-memory malware, and this is what you would think when you heard the term fileless malware, right? So it's code that's staged and executed, never gets written to any sort of secondary storage or persistent storage device on a system, right? So it's only present in, and this is what I'll call non-malware attacks. So these are attacks that typically don't make use of a malicious PE32 executable that's written somewhere on the file system. So they typically leverage valid operating system or system functionality. They can also use what are called dual-use tools. So think like PSExec that's included with the sysinternal suite from Microsoft, right? Tons of legitimate system administrators out there manage large numbers of Windows systems using that utility. At the same time, we've seen it rolled in with various malware. So that's what I talk about when I talk about dual-use tools. Tools that can be used, that are commonly used by both the good guys and the bad guys. So,
So let's talk a little bit about the anatomy of fileless malware to start. So I'm just going to go through these. There are 4 typical stages, and you'll see this also represented with traditional malware. You have the delivery, which is how the malware gets to you. The execution, when it's actually doing the things that are bad. Persistence, if it wants to maintain a foothold on the systems throughout the life cycle of the attack, that's how it'll do it. And then, obviously, the post-infection, what it's doing once it has that foothold, what does it want to do with that foothold? Get the data out, typically. So I'll start by talking a little bit about the differences between droppers and payloads. So this can kind of straddle the delivery and the execution stages, because when you're looking at droppers, it could be part of that delivery mechanism, part of a Word document, for example, where it's executing VBA code to do something else before it actually gets into the mainstream execution phase. And then the payload, which is the actual malware doing the bad things, getting the foothold, et cetera. Sure.
Yeah, so one of the reasons that we included this differentiation is because when I see the conversation that happens online a lot, I think a lot of people kind of merge these two things together, whereas you could have a dropper, and it could be responsible for dropping any payload, right? One day it could be dropping Locky. We've seen instances where Locky and Kovter are dual payloads that are distributed using the same dropper, right? The dropper is different from the payload. So when you consider, okay, is a piece of malware fileless or not, you've got to make that differentiation, because the dropper is not the malware. Malware can be distributed using an Office document. That Office document is not the malware. It's the actual payload that the Office document is typically going out, retrieving, and executing on a system. And I do make that differentiation because it's important when you consider, whether or not a malware payload is dropping an artifact, or whether the dropper just happens to use a file, but next week could use an exploit kit or something like that.
It's a clarity question, because this is kind of one of the problems I have with Fileless malware. Fileless malware should be referred to as a payload and nothing else.
Correct. I would agree with that.
All right, thank you. So looking at the delivery stage specifically, there are three most commonly seen types of delivery stages. You have the remote code execution, stuff like code red, where it's injecting its code, remote code execution directly against the service. It never leaves the memory space of that service. Mal spam campaigns, these are things you see every day. Word documents attached to an email, for example. Exploit kits. You're just browsing the web, you see an advertisement, it happens to go against Silverlight or Java or something like that. It'll execute that code. Again, it's part of that delivery stage. And here, a little bit more specific examples. The mouse spam, you get the attachment. It has code within VBA. When that document opens, it'll execute the code that's either embedded in it or execution stage, rather. You open that document, it has code embedded in it, maybe it's downloading code, it'll execute that code. At that point, it's entering the execution or doing the execution stage. Remote code and the exploit kit stuff, again, once that code is being executed on the system, execution stage is starting, it's running through the malware, doing the things it needs to do. And again, want to cycle back, the dropper, it may just be that first stage, straddling between delivery and execution. It may be execution in and of itself, but it's not the payload. It's not what's part of that ultimate execution stage. Here's some very specific examples. So looking at GoldenEye, this first, the top example you see here, there's code that's embedded in an Office document. It's just JavaScript code. But when you're allocating memory, it's writing that string to memory, and it's then executing it directly from memory. Again, not writing to disk at all. Persistent stage. He mentioned it earlier, but if there's persistence, there is disk activity going on, be it registry, WMI, whatever, scheduled task. If there's persistence, it has to write that somewhere in order to maintain through that log out, log in, reboot, whatever. And if it does implement persistence in the fileless way, what that typically means is that it's taking advantage of RunDLL,